Tell us what it's like to be wired as a swimmer, because I'm just not wired that way. Why swimming? Were you a kid and you just was like, I'm really good at this and I just want to compete as a swimmer? Like, how'd you wind up doing swimming as a kid?
I
You
mean,
know, com- yeah,
I was my mom is Dutch, so in the Netherlands are surrounded by water and there's a lot of
right.
streams and rivers all over the place. So obviously when I was there every couple of weeks for to visit my grandparents, because at that point we lived really close, what a very important thing for me to learn at an early age was how to swim. So I did that once a week in Germany, and I learned how to swim. And then when we moved here, I needed to find a sport because there's nothing that people do like part time. Like I was too old to start playing football because
Right.
people who played football started in second grade and already knew everything, and I wasn't really fond of hitting people. And lacrosse turned out to be a bad idea, so I started swimming, um, and it was a process. It took a while because I hated the fact that it was so competitive, and I hated the fact
Wow.
that it was more than twice a week. So it took until I started when I was, like, 10, and it took until I was about 12 for me to really start enjoying swimming, and I think part of it is just I think it takes a certain type of person, like, if you're a very active person in the sense that you like movement and doing different things, like someone who plays football or basketball isn't gonna like swimming because it's very active. Basketball and football are very active sports, like, there's a lot of movement in different directions. There's a lot of new
Totally.
stuff that happens, and there's a lot of excitement all the time. Swimming is a great sport, but it's remarkably boring unless you're a swimmer. Like it's just even as a swimmer, I have to say that the 4 hour long meets are boring. There's not a whole
Yeah.
lot you can really do about that. So it takes a certain type of person, a certain type of mentality to enjoy swimming. There's a lot of water polo players who try swimming just because and they want to get better at water polo. And most of them end up hating it just because it's back
Not
and
enough
forth for two
action, right?
hours.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
not enough action.
there's not a lot
Yeah.
of excitement really that goes into it. So the wiring definitely is it's a little more I wouldn't
Like
say
steady.
relaxed, but it's more steady, more constant.
Steady.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems
Um
like to really enjoy swimming, you've got to be like a super steady, sort of solid personality type, right? I would
yeah.
think. I mean,
Yeah,
and if
we don't have a lot of we have some volatile personalities, but those are generally the sprinters.
right,
Yeah, the kids that
not
have to get really aggressive for about 30 seconds and then they can relax for the next couple days, like, that's basically that personality, but for us on the mile, so I'm definitely not one of the more volatile personalities on a plane.
no, miles got to be crazy steady. What's the longest that people do? Is the mile the longest race, or
Um,
or is there more than a mile?
for indoor swimming, the mile is the longest you can
Hmm.
do. We have other events, like, there's, outdoor, there's, like, open water swimming, and you can swim, like, 10 miles.
Wow.
There's, we do a swim across America, which isn't a race, but it's more of a charity fundraiser, but that's 3 miles. So you can swim more than 1 mile, but if you're doing pool racing, then it's not gonna be more than a mile. You're looking at
And
more than a
how
mile.
long does it take to do a mile roughly in a pool?
Um, well, it takes about 16, 17 minutes depending on whether or not you're in meters or yards. And so obviously it's a pretty long time for a mile because runners take like 5 minutes or something like that. But yeah, it takes a longer time, and it's definitely not an exciting race to watch unless you're directly
Unless
facing
that's
someone.
your right, unless
Yeah,
that's your thing, right?
yeah.
So, are you have any interest down the road in being like a triathlete or anything like that? Like, where you're
Um,
doing longer swims and bike rides and runs?
my friend does triathlons, and we almost did a relay one once, but I haven't been on a bike in a while, apart from when I'm in Europe, and I don't run nearly often enough for me to start thinking about doing a triathlon. But I guess eventually, at some point, I might start doing it once swimming as a high school sport is over.
What does your gut say here? Do you think you're going to swim in college? You're going to let it go? What does your gut say?
I think it depends. I mean, I would like to, as of right now, I would like to swim in college, but I don't know. I think, well, let me rephrase that. I think it's I'm probably gonna end up swimming in college. I don't know if it's gonna be in the term of a varsity team or if it's gonna be a club team. Like, for
Got
example,
it.
if I were to go to a Division 1 program, I wouldn't the whether or not I wanna swim in college is gonna be a question that I might have to answer at that point, and right now I'd have to say it's 50-50 because a Division 1 program is great because of all these different opportunities for racing, and you're on a lot more competitive team. But at the same time, because you're on such a competitive team, it takes away from a lot of the opportunities you get as a student at that college. And a club program would allow me to keep swimming while at the same time having the opportunity to do things like study abroad and internships and those kinds of things. So a Division 3 program would probably be where I'd be most likely to swim on a varsity team, whereas a Division 1 program, I'd likely have to think about joining a club team instead.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we've talked about this before. A lot of D1 athletes that it's all in, at least
Mhm.
during the time of their sport, right? There's not a lot of room for much other than your team, your sport, and hopefully your grades.
Yeah.
But D3 makes a lot of sense, right? Because it gives you that flexibility to travel, to be international, to have other experiences, and so on. Sounds really interesting. What are you curious about here? Anything you want to ask me while you got me on a Zoom call here on a podcast? Doing something a
Um,
little bit different here?
I mean, I believe your wife is from Thailand, right? Or is from Thailand?
She is
And
Thai.
you
Yeah.
are from America. So how would you say that those two mixed, or I guess at the beginning of your relationship? Obviously now it's going to be different, but
Well,
you
you
asked
know
me
what?
about my
There's a
parents.
yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, look, I have a lot of playful answers. There's no way I'm going to be dead serious answering that question, but it will, underneath will be meaningful in the sense that, I playfully say that my wife is a lot like my Jewish mother was, except she's not intrusive or controlling. And I'm being, playful because it's my culture or whatever. I can do that, but she's remarkably, I literally met her on a blind date in Bangkok 3 years ago, and it's amazing how compatible we are. And I could, because I've had so many life experiences and because I waited so long to get married, I could recognize it pretty quick. I mean, I literally told like 3 or 4 people after our first date that if this woman could stay present with me, I'm going to marry her. And I use that metaphor. We talk a lot about being present because, people blow up not just swim meets, but relationships by getting in their head, right? By not being present, by doing some form of self sabotage. And it turned out, luckily for her and for us that, I mean, she was able to stay with it because, when I first met her, her English was maybe, I don't know. I remember being pulled over by a police officer on one of our road trips when we flew into LAX from Bangkok and then drove cross country. There was this Trooper Elmore, that pulled us over for no reason other than he was probably bored. And he asked me, how's my wife's English? And I told him at that time, 2.5 years ago, I told him it was 65%. But we laugh now because maybe it wasn't, and maybe we just we had such a crazy affinity and a strong connection that we were able to sort of work through those cultural differences. And even today, there's just certain things I let go, right? I'm older. I don't, I'm not in my 20s or 30s. You have less ego if you get a little bit smarter here about life. So I don't need her to be a certain way that I might have when I was younger, right? So I can let go of things like, religious affiliations and so on, and sort of address, we just work on the communication in our relationship and the flow and the love we have for each other. So I'm not as hung up as people that are younger on things that, like, might seem different on the surface, like religion, but really don't really have that much relevance when the love and the understanding is so powerful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think is the I lived in Germany and I spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, and obviously I've lived here in Greenwich. You've gone all over the place. What do you think is the number one thing you've learned from that kind of traveling? And what do you think is one thing that sets that apart from living in the same place your entire life?
Yeah, I love the question. It's another really good question. What have I learned from traveling so much? I've lived all over the United States in many different places. the West Coast. I've lived in Boulder and Santa Fe. I've even lived in Pensacola. Now we're here in, South Florida. And I've lived in China and Thailand. And, I've even, when I was a kid, we lived briefly in France for a summer. I think traveling, creates an open-mindedness and a flexibility and adaptability, because when you come into a different culture, you're not trying to impose your values on that culture. You're trying to understand their values and to assimilate while you're in that culture. And there's a lot of value in that. So it just helps you become I like to playfully say I'm more flexible and adaptive than almost everybody I meet, because I have lived so many places and I have been really good at adapting and really understanding other people's values and not necessarily imposing mine. And I think Americans at times have gotten a bad rap because they haven't always done that, right? They've sort of imposed their values. So I think understanding culture and understanding other people's way of doing life is fascinating. Like, I'm not afraid to ask anyone, and I do it all the time, what's your cultural background? I ask that all the time. What's your ethnicity? People are scared to ask that question, but it's fascinating. You learn so much from who your parents and grandparents were and how their cultures were different. So I think, in a general way, that's how I feel.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It's been, I mean, as much as I don't necessarily like the hyper competitive aspect of Greenwich, definitely been a lot of different things that I've learned and picked up from living here. Especially in some sense, there is a certain type of, it's much more extroverted here. People are much more extroverted in the sense that, but they're also very superficial, especially
Mm.
in Connecticut. And but there's positives to that. Everybody will say hi, and we should meet up for lunch sometime. Whether or not they actually want to meet up for lunch is debatable, but it's very different because when we went to Berlin, and everybody's very rude. So it's definitely been interesting to
That's
see the
interesting.
two, compare and contrast, kind of see how people actually treat others in their.
Well, as I'm listening to you, I'm playfully thinking, go live in LA. I mean, because there's, a lot of times in Los Angeles, you go have lunch with somebody and they pretend to be your best friend, or you're going to meet up again, and what I mean, and they want to see you and do business with you, and it's not, it's just the way it's sort of wired there. So yeah, places like Fairfield County can be tough. Greenwich in particular, the materialistic energy can be really intense, but like as you're saying, there's so much to learn. The good news for you is the more you experience, right, the more choice hopefully you have down the road. You get to decide, who am I and what am I about and where do I fit? It took me a long time to find my life partner. I was 51 when I met my wife. I had a lot of girlfriends, like I talked about. And it took me a long time to feel comfortable with where I want to home base. When I grew up in Connecticut, it never felt like home, even though I lived there and I had family there and friends there and clients there. And now where we're living here in South Florida, it just feels like an amazing fit as a sort of semi-tropical home base. So I'm a big, fan and advocate of being adventurous and being creative. And, even though you're wired like, super steady as a swimmer, that's wonderful, but let's live adventurously. How's that sound?
That sounds good.
All right, awesome. It's been a pleasure to have you, Eric Stemmen, senior swimmer at Greenwich High, and also on his way to like good things in the world. And I'm Dr. Brett. And as always, if you like what you're seeing, subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you next week on See It and Feel It with Dr. Brett. Thank you.